For more of this kind of content, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. The air thrummed with excitement as the Festival of Luminance reached its crescendo. Among the glowing bioluminescent trees, the pulsating rhythm of alien drums echoed across the expanse. Crowds of blue-skinned beings, humanoid but undeniably otherworldly, filled the vibrant festival grounds. Their laughter mingled with the shimmering lights that spiraled into the sky. It was a night for games, celebration, and the promise of something extraordinary. Ava strode through the revelry with practiced confidence, her black eyes scanning the scene. Her long, jet-black hair shimmered under the twin moons, a stark contrast to her azure skin. Every movement she made, from the sway of her hips to the way her lips curved into a smirk, radiated a rebellious energy. Ava wasn't here for idle chatter or the flowery customs her people adored. She wanted action and to win. The center of the festival teemed with activity as Elizabeth, Ava's grandmother, presided over the evening's highlight. Elizabeth was a legend, her wisdom and eccentricity woven into the fabric of their society. Dressed in flowing robes adorned with symbols of the ancients, her white hair shimmered like silver under the moonlight. Her black eyes held a glimmer of mischief as she unveiled this year's enigmatic prize. A shimmering stasis box hovered at the heart of the crowd. It pulsed softly, light and mist obscuring what lay inside. Whispers rippled through the crowd as Elizabeth stepped forward, her voice cutting through the cacophony. "This year," she began, her tone rich with mystery, "fate has delivered something rare, something magnificent." She gestured toward the box. "Behold a human. The one who wins this game will claim him. But remember, prizes of great value often carry great risk." A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. A human. The tales of Earth's people were the stuff of legend, whispered in awe. Few in this part of the galaxy had ever seen one in the flesh. Ava's interest was piqued. She wasn't entirely sure what to expect from a human, but her grandmother's tantalizing introduction was enough to ignite her competitive spirit. With a playful smirk, she approached the glowing wheel that would determine the winner. Elizabeth met her granddaughter's gaze with a knowing smile. "Feeling lucky tonight?" "Always," Ava replied, her voice steady with confidence. The wheel spun, its glowing runes blurring into a whirl of light. The crowd held its collective breath, the atmosphere electric. As the wheel slowed, the tension was palpable. Finally, it stopped, the glowing pointer landing squarely on Ava's symbol. A cheer erupted from the crowd, but Ava barely heard it. Her gaze was fixed on the box, which began to hum with energy. The shimmering light intensified as the box opened, its sides folding away like petals blooming under the sun. And there he was, tall and powerfully built. The man stepped forward. His dark hair fell in waves, framing a face that was both rugged and striking. His piercing green eyes locked onto Ava's, holding her in place. He radiated a confidence that bordered on defiance, his stance exuding strength and dominance. His earthly beauty was unlike anything Ava had ever encountered, and she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the world around them fading into a blur. Ava broke the silence, her smirk returning. "So, you're the prize." The man raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smile. "I don't recall signing up for this," he said, his voice rich and deep. "But here I am." The crowd's laughter rippled around them, but Ava and the man remained locked in their silent duel of wills. "Name's Ava," she said, stepping closer. "What do they call you, human?" "Alexander," he replied, his voice steady, his green eyes never wavering. "Alexander," she repeated, tasting the name. "You're mine now." Alexander chuckled, a low, resonant sound. "We'll see about that." Elizabeth's voice cut through the moment. "Remember, child," she said, her tone teasing but firm. "Fate's hand is never as simple as it seems. Be careful what you've won." Ava barely acknowledged her grandmother's cryptic warning. Her focus was on Alexander, who stood before her like a challenge she couldn't wait to conquer. She extended her hand toward him, and after a brief hesitation, he took it. His grip was strong, his touch warm, and as their hands connected, something unspoken passed between them. The crowd cheered, the festival continued, and Elizabeth watched with a satisfied gleam in her eye. The game had been played, the prize claimed, but the true stakes were only beginning to reveal themselves. She didn't know whether to be irritated or amused by his confidence. He stood there, unflinching, a living enigma, and despite herself, Ava couldn't help but admire the way he carried himself. He wasn't like anyone or anything she had ever encountered. "You must have questions," she said, breaking the silence. Plenty, Alexander replied. But let's start with the obvious. What's your deal? You don't seem like the festival type. Ava chuckled, her lips curling into a sly grin. I'm not. The games are the only part I care about. I like the challenge. And yet, here we are, he said, gesturing between them. She shrugged. I wasn't expecting you. Disappointed? He teased. Not yet, she shot back, her tone laced with playful defiance. Their exchange was interrupted by the sudden chirp of a communicator strapped to Ava's wrist. She frowned and activated the device. Her grandmother's voice crackled through, warm and enigmatic as ever. Ava, darling, I hope you're enjoying your prize. Ava rolled her eyes. What do you want, grandmother? Elizabeth's laughter floated through the speaker. Oh, nothing. Just a reminder this isn't just about you. Alexander's presence here is significant. You'll see soon enough. Before Ava could respond, the line went dead. She cursed under her breath, the cryptic message gnawing at her. Your grandmother always this mysterious? Alexander asked. Always, Ava muttered, her frustration evident. And it's infuriating. Alexander studied her for a moment. She seems to think there's a purpose to this. Do you? Ava hesitated. She didn't like to admit uncertainty, but the truth was, she didn't know what to think. I don't trust fate, she said finally. But I trust my instincts. And what are they telling you now? He asked, his voice low. That you're trouble, she said, meeting his gaze. His smirk deepened. Smart instincts. They fell into a companionable silence, the weight of the night settling over them. Despite the uncertainty, there was an undeniable pull between them, a thread of connection that neither could explain. Ava brought Alexander to her quarters, a sleek, minimalist space carved into the side of a massive, crystalline structure. The walls glowed faintly, casting soft light over the room's smooth surfaces. She gestured for him to sit, while she retrieved 2 glasses of a shimmering amber liquid. Drink, she said, handing him one of the glasses. It won't kill you. Alexander eyed the liquid warily before taking a tentative sip. The flavor was unlike anything he'd tasted before, sweet and smoky, with a hint of spice. He nodded appreciatively. Not bad. Ava leaned against the wall, her arms crossed as she studied him. So, tell me, Alexander, how did you end up here? Humans don't just show up in stasis boxes. He sighed, his gaze drifting to the glowing walls. That's the question, isn't it? I don't remember much. 1 minute, I was on Earth, and the next, I woke up in that box. Ava frowned. You don't remember how you got there? Nothing useful, he admitted. Just flashes, bright lights, strange sounds, and then nothing. Her black eyes narrowed. Sounds like someone wanted you off Earth. Looks that way, he said, his tone dark. The pieces didn't add up. Ava didn't like mysteries she couldn't solve, and Alexander was quickly becoming the biggest one of all. She sipped her drink, her mind racing with possibilities. I'll figure this out, she said, her voice resolute. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Why do you care? Because, she said, her gaze locking onto his, I don't lose. A slow smile spread across his face. I'm starting to like you, Ava. She smirked, her confidence returning. Good. You'll need to if you're sticking around. As the night wore on, the tension between them shifted, softening into something more familiar. They talked, trading stories and barbs, each testing the other's boundaries. Despite their differences, there was a sense of understanding between them, a bond that was slowly forming. But as Ava watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander's arrival was only the beginning of something far greater, something her grandmother had orchestrated with a purpose Ava was only beginning to glimpse. For better or worse, their fates were now entwined, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The twin moons hung low in the sky, their light pouring through the crystalline walls of Ava's quarters. The soft glow illuminated the room, casting a warm, almost intimate hue over everything. Alexander sat on the edge of the low seating platform, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp as it followed Ava's every movement. She was pacing, a nervous energy pulsing through her, though she tried to hide it. Ava had faced countless challenges in her life, physical, mental, and emotional, but nothing had prepared her for this. For him. Alexander was a contradiction, fiercely independent, yet thrown into her world, defiant, yet undeniably alluring. And worse, he seemed to know exactly how to push her buttons. You're awfully quiet tonight, Alexander said, breaking the silence. His voice, rich and deep, sent an inexplicable shiver down her spine. I'm thinking, she replied curtly, stopping in her tracks to look at him. About me? He teased, his green eyes gleaming with mischief. Ava rolled her eyes, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest. "Don't flatter yourself, human. I'm just saying," he said, leaning back slightly, his hands braced against the edge of the platform. "You seem tense." Her lips twitched, caught between a smirk and a scowl. "And you seem far too comfortable for someone who's been uprooted from his entire planet." Alexander shrugged. "Maybe I'm adaptable. Or maybe," he added, his gaze locking onto hers, "I'm just trying to figure you out." Ava's breath caught for a split second, but she recovered quickly. "Good luck with that," she said, her tone sharp, but not as cutting as she intended. She turned away, trying to shake the weight of his presence, but he was relentless. She could feel his eyes on her, the intensity of his attention like a physical touch. It was maddening and thrilling. "I think I'm starting to get it," Alexander said after a moment, his voice softer now. "You act tough, but you're not as impenetrable as you'd like people to believe." Ava froze. The words struck deeper than she cared to admit. She turned back to face him, her black eyes narrowing. "And what makes you think you know anything about me?" He stood then, his movements slow and deliberate, as he closed the distance between them. He stopped just short of her personal space, his towering presence forcing her to tilt her head to meet his gaze. "Because I see it," he said simply. Ava's heart raced, but she refused to back down. "You're awfully confident for someone who barely knows me?" Alexander smiled, but it wasn't mocking. It was warm, genuine, and disarming in a way that made her chest tighten. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just good at reading people." The air between them grew thick, charged with an energy neither of them could ignore. Ava's tough exterior wavered, her mind warring with her instincts. She had spent her entire life guarding herself, pushing people away before they could get too close. But Alexander was different. He wasn't just pushing, he was breaking through. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander reached up, brushing a strand of her dark hair away from her face. His touch was feather-light, but sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I think I'd like to find out." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she let herself lean into the possibility. The vulnerability scared her, but it also exhilarated her. She wasn't used to feeling this way off balance, exposed and alive all at once. She took a step back, creating a sliver of space between them. "You're dangerous, Alexander." He chuckled, the sound low and warm. "So are you." The words hung in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth between them. They were two forces colliding, unpredictable and volatile, but irresistibly drawn to each other. Ava shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "You're trouble, and you love it," Alexander said, his voice tinged with amusement. She laughed then, the sound genuine and free. It broke the tension, but it didn't dissolve it completely. Instead, it shifted, softening into something more intimate, more real. "Come on," Ava said, grabbing a blanket from a nearby chair and tossing it onto the seating platform. "If we're stuck together, we might as well make the best of it." Alexander raised an eyebrow but followed her lead, sitting beside her on the platform. The warmth of his body was a constant presence, a quiet reminder of how close they were. As the night deepened, their conversation turned quieter, more personal. They spoke of their worlds, their lives, their hopes and fears. Bit by bit, they let their walls down, revealing parts of themselves they hadn't shared with anyone else. When Ava finally drifted off to sleep, her head resting lightly against Alexander's shoulder, he smiled to himself. For the first time since he had arrived in this strange new world, he felt at peace. And as the twin moons continued their journey across the sky, the bond between them grew stronger, unspoken, but undeniable. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, and neither of them would be the same. The soft, muted glow of dawn seeped into Ava's quarters, casting shadows that danced along the crystalline walls. Ava stirred, her dark eyes fluttering open, to find herself still leaning against Alexander's shoulder. For a moment, she was caught off guard by the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, grounding her in a way she didn't expect. But then reality came rushing back the festival, the strange prize, her grandmother's cryptic words, and him. She pulled away abruptly, standing and brushing her hands against her sides, as if shaking off the vulnerability of the moment. Alexander, roused by her movement, blinked and looked up at her, his green eyes sharp despite the early hour. "Good morning to you too," he said, his voice low and slightly groggy. "We need to talk," Ava said, ignoring his easy tone. There was a tension in her posture, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Alexander straightened, his expression serious now. "About what?" "About why you're here," she replied, her voice clipped. about why my grandmother chose you as the prize." Alexander stood, his tall frame towering over her, but his gaze was calm, steady. "I told you, I don't know how I got here. I don't remember anything useful. Don't you think that's a little too convenient?" She shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "People don't just end up in stasis boxes. Someone wanted you here, and I want to know why." "I want to know too, Ava," he said, his voice tinged with an edge of his own. "You think this is easy for me? 1 minute, I'm living my life, and the next, I'm thrust into this." She winced at the intensity in his voice, but didn't back down. "And yet, you're taking it all remarkably well, because panicking won't solve anything," he countered. "But maybe working together will." The words hung between them, a challenge and a truce wrapped in one. Ava hesitated, her stubbornness warring with the logic in his statement. Finally, she let out a breath and nodded. "Fine," she said. "We'll figure this out together." They began by combing through the festival grounds, retracing Elizabeth's steps from the night before. Ava led the way, her movements purposeful but tense. Alexander followed, his sharp gaze taking in everything, his presence a steady contrast to her agitation. Elizabeth was nowhere to be found, but Ava wasn't surprised. Her grandmother had a knack for disappearing when she was most needed. Instead, they turned to the elders who had helped set up the games. The elders were cryptic, as usual, speaking in riddles and half-truths that only fueled Ava's frustration. "Fate aligns where bonds are forged," one of them said, her voice dreamy. "The thread between you is older than time itself." "What does that even mean?" Ava snapped, her patience wearing thin. The elder merely smiled, her black eyes twinkling with amusement. "You'll see." As they left the elder's tent, Ava let out a growl of frustration. "I swear, talking to them is like trying to catch mist." Alexander smirked. "It's almost impressive how unhelpful they can be." She shot him a look, but couldn't suppress a small smile. His dry humor was growing on her, even if she hated to admit it. Back in her quarters, they sat across from each other, the tension between them palpable. Ava drummed her fingers on the table, her mind racing as she pieced together what little they had learned. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "They said something about a thread," he said after a moment. "What do you think that means?" Ava frowned. "Probably some poetic nonsense about destiny." "Or," Alexander countered, "it could mean there's an actual connection between us, something we haven't figured out yet." She looked at him, her skepticism clear. "Like what?" He hesitated, then reached out, his hand hovering just above hers. "Can I try something?" She stared at his hand, her instincts telling her to pull away, but her curiosity won out. "Fine," she said, her voice cautious. When his hand touched hers, a shock ran through them both, not painful, but powerful, like a pulse of energy that vibrated down to their very cores. They both gasped, their eyes locking as the sensation lingered. "What was that?" Ava whispered, her voice shaking. Alexander's grip tightened slightly, his expression serious. "I don't know, but I felt it too." They sat there in silence, their hands still connected, the air between them heavy with the weight of the moment. Slowly, a memory began to surface in Alexander's mind, a flash of light, a sense of overwhelming emotion, and a voice he didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. "I think I've seen you before," he said, his voice barely audible. Ava's eyes widened. "That's impossible." "Maybe," he said, "but I'm telling you, I feel like I've met you. Not here, not like this, but somewhere." Ava pulled her hand away, breaking the connection. The absence of his touch was jarring, leaving her feeling exposed and unsteady. "This doesn't make any sense," she muttered, standing and pacing again. "None of it does." "Maybe it's not supposed to," Alexander said, standing as well. "Maybe we're just supposed to figure it out as we go." She stopped and looked at him, her walls crumbling just a little. "And what if we can't?" He stepped closer, his green eyes unwavering. "Then we keep trying." For the first time, Ava let herself believe that they might actually find answers, not just about him, but about the strange pull between them. And as much as it scared her, it also gave her hope. Just as they were beginning to make sense of the puzzle, the communicator on Ava's wrist chirped. She answered it reluctantly, her grandmother's face appearing on the small screen. "Ah, there you are," Elizabeth said, her tone light but knowing. "How are my two favorite troublemakers?" "Cut the games, grandmother," Ava said, her voice firm. "We need answers. Now." Elizabeth's smile widened. "And you shall have them. But answers come with time and courage. Are you ready for what you might find?" Ava hesitated, her heart pounding. She glanced at Alexander, who gave her a small nod, his expression resolute. "Yes." Ava said, her voice steady. "We're ready." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed, and her smile turned sly. "Then come to me, my darlings. The truth awaits." The line went dead, leaving Ava and Alexander standing in the quiet room, their resolve solidifying. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And as they set out to uncover the truth, neither could shake the feeling that their connection ran deeper than either of them had ever imagined. The crystalline halls of the Elder's sanctuary echoed with the faint hum of Ava's boots as she and Alexander approached Elizabeth's chamber. The journey from Ava's quarters had been silent, the tension between them building with each step. The earlier connection they had felt, the shock, the bond had made them uneasy, and Ava's sharp focus on getting answers mirrored Alexander's quiet determination. Elizabeth sat serenely on a throne-like chair carved from shimmering quartz, her white hair cascading down her back. The matriarch's black eyes sparkled with mischief as she watched them approach. "You've come," she said, her voice as calm and teasing as ever. "I trust you felt it by now, the pull, the connection." "Enough games, grandmother," Ava snapped, her frustration spilling over. "What's going on? Why did you bring him here?" Elizabeth tilted her head, a smile playing on her lips. "Ah, Ava, always so direct. Very well. I'll tell you, though you may not like what you hear." She gestured for them to sit, but neither of them moved. Sighing, she leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "The bond you two feel isn't a coincidence," she began. "It's the result of an ancient ritual, a thread that was woven between your souls long before you were born." Ava stiffened, her jaw tightening. "What are you talking about?" Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Alexander, her tone serious now. "You, Alexander, are here because your ancestors and ours struck a pact. Long ago, a human and one of our kind formed a connection so strong that it bridged the vast distances between our worlds. To honor that bond, a ritual was performed, binding their descendants across generations." Alexander's green eyes darkened, his hands balling into fists. "You're saying this was planned? That I'm here because of some ancient agreement I didn't consent to?" Elizabeth nodded. "In a way, yes. The thread between you is the culmination of that pact. It's why you feel drawn to each other, why you both sense something deeper at play." Ava's fists clenched at her sides, her voice rising with anger. "So, this whole thing, the stasis box, the festival prize, it was all you're doing?" Elizabeth met her granddaughter's glare with calm resolve. "I merely set the stage. The rest was up to fate." "That's manipulative," Ava shouted, her voice echoing through the chamber. "You used us like pieces in one of your games." Alexander stepped forward, his anger bubbling to the surface. "And what about me? You plucked me from my life, my home, and threw me into this without so much as a warning." Elizabeth stood, her demeanor unshaken. "I understand your anger, both of you, but you must realize this. The bond between you is no accident. It's the key to something greater, something that could unite our worlds in ways you can't yet imagine." Ava turned to Alexander, her black eyes blazing. "So, what now? Do we just accept this? Accept that our lives have been manipulated for some grand cosmic experiment?" Alexander's voice was cold, his green eyes hard as they met hers. "I didn't ask for this any more than you did. But let's be clear, this isn't just about you, Ava." Her anger flared at his words. "You think I don't know that? I'm the one who's been dragged into this mess too, remember?" Elizabeth's voice cut through their heated exchange, calm but commanding. "Enough. I understand your frustration, but you must focus. The bond between you is real, whether you accept it or not. And it's more than just a connection, it's a responsibility." "Responsibility?" Ava scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "For what? To play along with your manipulative schemes?" Elizabeth stepped closer, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "The connection between you has the power to change everything for both our worlds, but only if you're willing to work together." Ava and Alexander stood in silence, their anger simmering just below the surface. The weight of Elizabeth's words hung heavy in the air, forcing them to confront the reality of their situation. Finally, Alexander broke the silence, his voice low but firm. "If this bond is real, then we deserve to decide what it means, not you." Ava nodded, her anger still palpable but tempered by a flicker of agreement. "For once, I agree with him. This is our lives, our choices." Elizabeth's expression softened, a hint of pride glimmering in her eyes. "Then make your choices wisely. But remember this, the thread between you is unbreakable. You can fight it, deny it, even hate it, but it will always be there." With that, she stepped back, her gaze lingering on them both. "Now go." The path ahead is yours to walk. The walk back to Ava's quarters was tense, the air between them thick with unresolved emotions. When they finally arrived, Ava turned to Alexander, her expression hard, but not as fiery as before. "So," she said, her voice sharp, "what do we do now?" Alexander crossed his arms, his green eyes searching hers. "Figure out what this connection really is, on our terms." Ava studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine. But don't think for a second that I'm going to let this thread, this bond, define me." "Good," Alexander said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Because I wouldn't expect anything less from you." Despite the tension, there was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile truce forged in the heat of their shared anger. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, determined to reclaim their agency in the face of fate. The tension in Ava's quarters was a storm waiting to break. The air felt heavy, charged with the unspoken emotions simmering beneath the surface. Ava sat by the crystalline window, staring out at the twin moons hanging low in the sky. The glow reflected off her blue skin, casting her features in sharp relief. Behind her, Alexander paced like a caged predator, his frustration barely held in check. The revelation of their bond had thrown them both into turmoil, and neither was willing to let fate dictate their lives. "We need to find a way to break this," Ava said, her voice breaking the tense silence. Alexander stopped pacing, his green eyes narrowing. "And how do you suggest we do that? It's not like there's a guidebook for undoing cosmic soul threads." Her jaw tightened, her frustration bubbling over. "I don't know, but I'm not going to let some ancient pact control me." "Control you?" Alexander's voice rose, his anger flaring. "Do you think I want this any more than you do? I had a life, Ava. A life that's been ripped away because of this connection." Ava turned to face him, her black eyes blazing. "You think I don't know that? You're not the only one whose life has been upended." They stood facing each other, their emotions raw and unfiltered. The anger between them was like a crackling flame, but beneath it, something deeper smoldered, a heat neither of them could ignore. Alexander took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, resonant tone. "Maybe we're going about this the wrong way." Ava raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his green eyes locking onto hers. "If this bond is as powerful as Elizabeth claims, maybe fighting it isn't the answer. Maybe we need to understand it first." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her mind racing. She hated the idea of giving in, even partially, but she couldn't deny the logic in his words. "Fine," she said finally, "but understanding it doesn't mean accepting it." "Agreed," he said, his voice softening. "We do this on our terms." They sat opposite each other on the low seating platform, the distance between them feeling both too much and not enough. Ava reached out her hand, tentatively, her black eyes meeting Alexander's. He mirrored her movement, their fingers brushing lightly before connecting. The shock returned, a jolt of energy that pulsed through their bodies. But this time, they didn't pull away. Instead, they leaned into it, letting the sensation flow between them. Ava's breath hitched as images flickered through her mind, memories that weren't hers, emotions that felt alien, yet familiar. She saw flashes of Alexander's life on Earth, the warmth of sunlight on his face, the sharp tang of sea air, the ache of loss he carried deep within him. Alexander's green eyes widened as he experienced the same phenomenon. He saw fragments of Ava's life, her defiant laughter, as she outsmarted her rivals, the weight of expectations she had carried since childhood, the vulnerability she hid behind her confident exterior. When the connection faded, they sat in stunned silence, their hands still clasped. "What was that?" Ava whispered, her voice trembling. "I think," Alexander paused, his voice heavy with emotion. "I think it's us. All of it, the good, the bad, the parts we don't show anyone else." Ava pulled her hand away, her heart racing. The intimacy of the experience had shaken her more than she cared to admit. "This doesn't mean anything," she said, her tone sharp. "It's just the bond." "Maybe," Alexander said, his voice steady but his green eyes searching hers. "Or maybe it means more than we want to admit." The hours passed in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. Ava sat curled up on the seating platform, her arms wrapped around her knees. Alexander stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the soft glow of the moons. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why do you keep fighting this?" Ava looked up, her black eyes meeting his. "Because I don't trust it. I don't trust anything I didn't choose." He nodded, understanding flashing across his face. Neither do I. But maybe it's not about trust. Maybe it's about what we do with it. She laughed bitterly. And what are we supposed to do? Pretend this is some great cosmic love story? No, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a low, intimate tone. But we can stop pretending we don't feel it. Ava's breath caught as he knelt before her, his green eyes boring into hers. The distance between them disappeared, replaced by a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Her heart raced, her mind screaming at her to pull away, but her body refused to move. I feel it, Ava, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I know you do too. She opened her mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both hesitant and charged. The world seemed to tilt as the kiss deepened, the anger and frustration between them transforming into something fiery and consuming. Their hands roamed cautiously, their touches lingering but restrained, the unspoken promise of more lingering in the air. But just as quickly as it began, Ava pulled back, her breathing ragged. "This doesn't mean we're okay," she said, her voice trembling. Alexander smiled, his green eyes softening. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you." She laughed despite herself, the sound breaking the tension. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before: hope.